In this video I'm going to make a mid-century inspired style corner cabinet using some Iroko veneered plywood boards that I've had stored for a few years. I think it's Iroko anyway, but I could be wrong. This build video features the most problems and mistakes that I've ever experienced on a project, and honestly it was pretty devastating, but more on that later. As you'll see, it has a solid wood trim which has been joined with biscuits to the front edge and a nice thick face veneer, which means I'll be able to sand this with my random orbit sander without worrying about sanding through it, which is good because it has a lot of scratches and scuffs. I can then start cutting pieces to length based on a rough drawing that I'd done on a scrap of paper. I wanted to join these boards together to make wider panels, and in order to get clean joints between boards I decided to rip a clean edge at the table saw, and for the boards that are going to be placed in the middle of these panels I'm going to remove the solid wood trim. I started by gluing up the top and bottom panels, so here I'm marking up the shape that I need using a speed square, and you can see I've cut each board to different lengths as I really want to minimise the waste on this project and get as much out of this material as possible. I added some masking tape so that I can make some pencil marks without drawing on the wood, and I'll use these marks to line up my domino machine so that I can drill out some mortises to help align all of the boards during the glue up. And here's where I made my first mistake. I guess I hadn't tightened the depth stop on the fence of the domino correctly, because as I was making the cuts, the fence slipped and my mortises plunged through the bottom of the plywood. That was annoying, and I didn't have enough material to make another panel, so I'd have to live with it. But the thing is, it's the underside of the top panel which will be inside a cabinet, so no big deal, I can live with it. And if it bothered me that much, I could always glue on a piece of plywood or veneer or something to cover it up. But little did I know that things would get a lot worse later on. So anyway, I cut new mortises with the depth fence locked firmly in place this time, and got them all glued and clamped together for both the top and bottom panels. I left them overnight and then got them out of the clamps. And next I can cut away the waste using my track saw, and I'm cutting both together to make sure that they're identical, and once again I'm relying on my speed square to make sure that all of the cuts were made at 45 degrees. For the front edge of these panels I want to retain enough of the solid wood trim to form a mitre, so here I'm marking up the material that I want to keep all the way around the boards, and I made the cuts with the tenon saw. I can then carefully cut up to that saw curve using my track saw as far as possible, and then finished off with my Japanese pull saw. Then I just needed to do a bit of clean up with a sharp chisel, and I'm ready to cut a trim piece which I can butt up to the mitre using one of the offcuts from earlier. That joint looks pretty good, so I cut it to length and glue it in place, and I'm using some masking tape just to pull it in nice and tight. I've sized the unit so that I can use a couple of the uncut boards as side panels to be positioned like this. But I want to add a rebate into the back edge of these, so I fit a rebating bit into the router table and made a few passes aiming for about a 6mm deep rebate, which will later accommodate a back panel. Here I'm deciding where to put shelves inside the unit, and to mount the shelves I'm just going to glue and pin some cleats to the inside of the side panels. I thought about cutting some housing grooves for the shelves, but these won't be visible on the inside of the unit anyway, so I went for the quick and easy option. Next I need to join the side panels to the bottom panels, so I make some more marks and then I can cut the mortises in the ends of the side panels and then make the plunge cuts into the bottom panel. And I used my clamping squares to make sure they were held at 90 degrees while the glue sets. And I pulled out a piece of 12mm hardwood plywood that I can use to cut a back panel that will support the shelves, and I want to cut both edges at 45 degrees at the table saw. 18mm plywood would have been a better option here, but I'm just using what I had to hand. I cut it to length and then I can mark up where the shelves will be, and for this I'm going to cut a housing joint for the shelves, which I did with a straight bit in my trim router guided by my speed square. I took these cuts in 2 passes to give me the depth I wanted for the shelves, and then I can measure up what size my shelves will need to be. And I'm using more of the 12mm plywood for this, and it took me a few attempts to get this right, so you'll see a few odd pencil marks here and there. But eventually I had the shape I needed and I cut that out with the track saw. You'll see that I'm leaving a bit of extra material at the back of the shelf just in case it's needed to fit into the housing joint, but I ended up not needing that and trimming it away later on. I offered up the shelf, making sure that the back panel is at 90 degrees to the bottom, and it was slightly too big, so I make some marks for where I want to trim away some more material because I wanted to leave enough room to add back panels later on, which will attach to both the 45-degree edges of the back panel and inside the rebates on the side panels. Once my first shelf is the correct shape, I can then simply draw around it and cut out the second shelf so that they are identical. And I'm not too fond of the colour of this plywood, so after sanding it I decided to stain it dark using some dark oak stain. And then I can get some finish on, and I'm using spray varnish here. In future I'll be doing all of my spraying using an air compressor and proper spray gun, which I invested in recently and have a couple of videos about, but I've got a few cans of this to use up, and also it dries quickly, which enables me to carry on working. So here's another mistake. I had intended to mask off the front edge trim and then stain the bottom shelf to match the others, but here I am applying finish to it. That's not a major problem though, I can live with that. But again, things are going to get a lot worse very soon. The varnish really brought out the beauty in this wood grain. I absolutely love the way this looks. Anyway, I applied 3 coats of varnish, denibbing in between coats with some 400 grit wet and dry paper. Next I can glue in the shelves, and I'm using some polyurethane glue for this, mainly because it sets quickly so that I can continue working. And a couple of brad nails secure the back panel to the back of the shelf while the glue sets, and I can add brad nails through the shelf into the cleats too. I also added a glue block to secure the back panel in position, and it'd be a good idea to add some screws here for some mechanical strength, although I don't think I got around to doing that in the end. So here is where things started going really bad. I'm marking up where to cut mortises to join the side panels to the top. I can then cut the mortises in the side panels and then the top, and I used time-lapse mode in my camera for this next shot, which is probably a good thing because you don't get to hear all my profanities. Not only am I cutting mortises on the wrong side of my line here, but I also didn't think to change the plunge depth, so I plunged through the top, ruining the top panel and also ruining my brand new router table lift. Proof, if it were needed, that I am simply not allowed to own nice things. Anyway, I got new mortises cut, and then the top fitted pretty nicely aside from the multiple wrongly placed domino holes on the underside, and of course the one right through the veneer on the top, which by the way you'll see here I've plugged with a small piece of a domino. To be honest, I was close to giving up on this project, but I figured that I may as well have a go at repairing it, so here is me entering repair mode. I offered up the offcuts to see if any of the veneer looked to be a good match to the wood grain on the top, and after finding the closest matching piece that I could, I cut the face veneer off at the bandsaw. Here I'm carefully lining up the grain as best I can and marking up the shape for the piece of veneer that I want to splice in. I cut it out, sanded the edges straight, and then marked around it onto the top. And after setting up my router to cut to the depth of the thickness of the veneer, I then route away most of the material, staying inside my pencil lines. And then I chiselled away the rest right up to the lines. Then it was just a case of offering it up, removing a bit at a time until I got a really nice tight fit. I added plenty of glue and popped it in. And then a piece of MDF wrapped in packaging tape so that the glue doesn't stick to it gets clamped firmly in place. After an hour or two I removed the clamps to see what I was left with, and it actually looked like it might be workable, so I sanded it flush and then I decided I needed to see what it would look like with some finish on, so I did the final sanding and then applied a coat of varnish. Then I denibbed, and I gave it a second coat, but this time I brushed on some water-based varnish because I thought a thicker coat might help level things off a bit more. And it looked pretty good, but there were a couple of small gaps. So I found the closest colour matching hard wax filler stick and used a hot knife to melt it into some of those gaps. And then I can scrape away the excess with a knife blade. And then a final coat of varnish on top. This repair was never going to be perfect, especially when you look at it in these lighting conditions, but once this is indoors, I doubt anyone will even notice it, unless they're looking for it. So that's good enough for me. I'm not done making mistakes yet though, so stay tuned for more. Next I can make the doors for the cabinet, so I measured up and I have a piece of plywood with the same species of wood as a veneer. The only problem is that it's only 6mm thick, which is a bit too thin for the doors, so I'm going to glue on another 6mm thick piece of plywood to give me a 12mm thick panel to use for the doors. I got as much weight on there as I could to squeeze out any air gaps. And once it was dry I cut it to length using the track saw. And the glue up looked pretty decent. I needed to cut the edges at 45 degrees, so I tilted my table saw blade and made those cuts to give me a panel that was basically the size of the opening or a tiny bit bigger so that I can trim it down later if necessary. And then I can cut this panel in half to give me two doors, and the kerf cut here will be the gap between the two doors once they're mounted. Next I can mount the hinges, and I have some of these brass hinges that I salvaged from an old piece of furniture. They're a bit dirty, but I can clean them up later with some Brasso. I decided where I wanted them placed and then marked around them with a marking knife. I can then remove material with a chisel to create a recess for the hinge to sit in. And this is where I realised that I'm going to run the risk of the screws piercing through the veneer on the front of the doors. So to get around that, I decided to try drilling the pilot holes at a slight angle. I then added the screws, and to be honest it didn't look good with the screw heads all higgledy-piggledy. But I decided to carry on anyway and get the doors mounted while I thought about it. So here I'm marking up the position of the hinges onto the cabinet, and I can get those drilled out and the screws added. And not only did those screw heads not look good, but they also prevented the door from closing properly because the screw heads were hitting each other due to that angle. But while the door was fitted, I could at least mark up the location of the hinges so that I could then remove the doors and then get those recesses cut out with a chisel too. I had a good think about how to resolve my hinge issue, and the solution I came up with was to add a mitered border to the front of the doors. I had some solid wood, which again I presume is Iroko, that I could rip down to size at the table saw and then plane to thickness. And I also added a bevel at the router table just to make it look a bit prettier. And then I can start cutting the miters and getting the pieces mounted to the fronts of the doors. And this frame on the front of the doors is basically going to give me more material for the screws to bite into to mount the hinges, so that I no longer need to worry about piercing through that veneer on the front. So I can now get the screws added at the correct angle this time, and I was a bit worried about whether the screws would bite into the wood well enough, having already drilled them at a different angle, but they bit in just fine and got a good hold. And the door's now shut fully too. But I'm not done making mistakes yet. Next I'm going to turn some legs for the unit using a piece of mystery salvaged hardwood. I cut the workpiece square at the table saw first, and then cut 3 legs to length at the miter saw, and I used the roughing gouge at the lathe to get them to rough shape. And then the spindle gouge just to get a nice clean finish. After a bit of sanding, I apply some of my handmade oil wax finish. This is available to buy via my Etsy store if you're interested, and I'll leave a link in the description box below. To secure the legs to the bottom of the unit, I first drilled a hole through the top of the legs right in the centre, and this was also a mistake in hindsight, as I really should have drilled these using a drill chuck on my lathe so that my holes would have been perfectly concentric to the legs. I then found some threaded rod and I'm going to glue this in with some epoxy. I got plenty of epoxy on there and then add it to the leg, trying to make sure that it's sitting as straight as possible. I then drilled out holes on the underside of the bottom panel where I can add some of these threaded insert nuts. These aren't going to give me a super strong connection, to be honest, but it'll be fine for a unit that will sit in the corner of our dining room for the next however many years. We don't plan on moving it around. Although I didn't drill my holes perfectly straight in the legs, they seemed to connect reasonably well and felt good and strong. I did some final sanding touch-ups and then blow away all of the dust ready to add finish. And I have some nice vintage brass handles which I bought on eBay that I'm going to mount to the doors. I made a template using a piece of masking tape to get my holes positioned correctly, and added a couple of brass washers on the inside to receive the bolts. After positioning the doors in their stop position, I also used an offcut of Iroko to glue to the underside of the top panel to act as a stop bead for the doors to close onto. Then I can add some back panels, and I'm going to use some horrible 3mm packaging hardboard for this that came with a door delivery a few months back. I'm really not precious about using nice material for these back panels, as I'm going to be drilling loads of holes through them later, which I'll explain in more detail in a bit. So after cutting it to size, I glue and pinned it in place. And I added my maker's mark to the bottom of the unit. So now for one final mistake. After adding the solid wood trim to the front of the doors earlier, the doors were a bit heavier and that made the unit feel a little bit front heavy, so when both doors were open, it felt like it wouldn't need much for it to tip over. So after bringing the unit inside, I decided to relocate the two front legs on the bottom, basically just bringing them forward to resolve that issue. And then it was much better. I made this unit to hold some audio equipment, a small amplifier and a Google Chromecast audio so that we can cast music from our phones through these absolutely beautiful vintage Wharfedale Linton 3XP speakers that I recently found for £5 at our local recycling centre resale store. So as I said, the back panels are going to need a few holes so that I can push through plugs and speaker cables and all of that kind of stuff. So you might not be too surprised to hear that this project wasn't all that enjoyable for me at all due to the amount of mistakes and problems. I'd love to say I was just having an off day, but I was working on this project on and off for a few days, so it must have been several off days. In total it took around 16 hours to complete. Despite all the issues, it's obviously far from being perfect, but I am relatively pleased with how it turned out, which I think goes to show that sometimes problem solving and not giving up on things can be worthwhile. But it did leave me feeling quite drained and like I didn't want to work on anything else for a while, so expect to see a few non-project related videos on my channel in the coming weeks, as I think my brain just needed a bit of a break from making things. Please subscribe to my channel for more weekly woodworking videos if you'd like to help support the channel and get exclusive content, early access to my videos, free project plans and cut lists, and a name credit at the end of my videos. You can find links below to my YouTube channel membership and Patreon pages, or you can make a one-off donation via PayPal. Thank you for watching.